I tried, there's been a lot of books on Iraq and Afghanistan, and so I think mine's a little different, and I didn't want to write a book about kind of, with a bunch of arguments about who was right and who was wrong, and why there was no plan, and the hows and whys, and all the arguments that I think we all know, and frankly, we're all exhausted by. I kind of had this I've had this unique experience over the past 10 years, and it wasn't for any planning on my part. I was working in India, and the opening chapter in the book, it's 10 years ago, almost to the day. I was sitting in the Kabul sports stadium on a Friday afternoon. At midfield, I was an honored guest, and watching these very strange, funny-looking people bring a man out to midfield and cut his hand off, and then bring another one onto the field and put him to death, all the while reading, verses from the Quran. And that was a long time ago. And at the time, it's very strange to look back on that period, because of course at the time it didn't mean a thing. It was just this kind of faraway place that nobody really thought much about. I certainly didn't know much about it. And of course it wasn't until some years later, by about 10 a.m. on September 11th, when it all started to kind of come together. But I wanted to kind of write a book about just what it feels like. Whenever I came back from Iraq and from Afghanistan, the first question people ask me is like, "What's it like over there?" And I usually tell them a story. So this is kind of a collection of just scenes and vignettes and things that I saw. I wanted to write about what it felt like. I wanted to write about the desert and the sweat and the blood, and I wanted to write about what it's like to go to a car bombing, and I wanted to write about what it's like to sit across from a Sunni sheikh who you are certain is lying to you. Kind of what it felt like. I wanted to boil it down to its essence. And if I had a model for the book, I'm going to show you some pictures in a sec. But if I had a model for the book, there was a film that came out about 15 years ago called 32 Short Films about Glenn Gould, the Canadian pianist. And I think if my book had a subtitle, it would be 87 Short Films about Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't explain very much. I don't argue very much. You won't find any policy in my book, but I hope you'll have kind of a sense of what it's like there if you take the time to read it. I'm very fortunate. Almost wherever I went, I had some very talented photographers with me, and so almost every scene in the book, I actually have a photo for. They're not the photos. Most of the photos aren't in the book. So I thought what I would do, instead of just sort of stand up here and read the whole time, I thought I would kind of go through a couple of photos from my time, and I'll stop in a couple of places, and I'll kind of read a couple of paragraphs, and then I'm going to time myself right now. When I start to go, when you kind of when you step off the helicopter into Afghanistan for the first time, it's like, it's just astonishing. I hope you all can see that over here. It's like you're walking into the 4th century, It's just astonishing. I mean, you go into these villages that, haven't seen the wheel yet. There's no water, there's no electricity. The irrigation system is the same thing they were using, in the 12th century. It's just astonishing, And I want to just go through some pictures from that time. It's such an amazing country. This is from 1999 in northern Afghanistan. This is actually a donkey parking lot, and that is Father Time himself, kind of bringing everyone in there. It really was a donkey parking lot. I want to just scroll. This is a village in northern Afghanistan, and this is pretty good. I mean, this is basically what a typical village is in northern Afghanistan. I want to go through. This is actually, Afghanistan is this kind of blighted country, it's like kind of, everything in the Bible, it's like, plagues and famines, and in this case it was an earthquake, and this is actually a ravine that opened up that was about a mile long and about a half-mile across, and I remember James Hill, who took most of these photos that you'll see, we were sort of calling out to these women, and they were kind of, on a pilgrimage to nowhere, but let me just, I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to stop and read for just a second. Typical village again. Yes, they're very, very nice. James Hill was the photographer who took most of these. And, you know, James and I were practically, I mean, I spent more time with James than I had with just about anybody in my entire life. And by the end of about 6 months together in Afghanistan, we were practically married. But he's actually married and he has 2 kids. But this is a nice photo. This is a camera. It's one of these old box cameras, and it costs, you know, like a nickel, and you could get your photo taken. And the old man here is actually the young man in the photo. So he's very sort of happily sitting there. And if you look like me in this part of the world, I mean, I look like a CIA agent when I walk around Afghanistan. You'll sort of see, you'll draw a crowd of people almost anywhere where you go. This is northern Afghanistan in 1999. I'm just gonna, I'll flip through a couple of more of these. This is an astonishing photo. This is Jaidi Maiwand, and that is I mean present tense, the main shopping street in Kabul. This is downtown Kabul in September 1998. And if you really seriously, you know, for me, when people say 9/11, you know, what do you think of, right? There's all these arguments, why, how. That's why. For me, the country that I remember kind of walking into 10 years ago it was just totally destroyed. It was obliterated. I mean, the whole sort of society had basically disintegrated. There were people living in the rubble here. And kind of the way to, for me, the way to kind of understand what happened and kind of how the Taliban kind of rose up and, you know, Al-Qaeda and the whole thing was it was total anarchy in Kabul. You know, the Soviet Union had left in 1989. Then the civil war in Afghanistan started. And basically these, you know, these warlords were kind of fighting it out. And I think at one point, I remember somebody said to me, it's in the book, but he said, you know, in 1992, at the height of the Civil War, before the Taliban came, there were 41 different militias that were fighting over Kabul. And so he said, just to drive from one side of Kabul to the other, you know, I couldn't take my daughter, I couldn't take my son, I had to pay bribes, you know, the whole thing. And then the Taliban came along, you know, and they were the meanest, toughest, nastiest dudes on the block, but they were righteous and they believed in law and order. And that's, you know, so in the beginning, when I went to the Kabul Sports Stadium on the Friday afternoon, and I watched them put the man to death. You know, there was no cheering coming from the crowd that day, but people understood. And I remember the guy was, you know, as they were executing the man, there was a guy holding a Quran, and he was reading. He was saying, "In revenge there is life. In revenge there is life." And that's basically from the Quran. And then he kind of digressed at one point, and he said, we have to do this. We have to do this. If we don't do this, the anarchy will return, you know? And it made sense to a lot of people at the time. But anyway, it was a strange time. And this is sort of father and son glass blowers. You know, the Afghans are just, they have these extraordinary faces. You know, they really do. They photograph very well. Let me just, there's actually 4 sisters. I want to get to another photo, and then I'm going to read you something. This is sort of the Afghan version of American Gothic, I thought, you know. It's sort of father and son with preemie, you know. Now, this is kind of, actually, this is a great photo. This is Talakan, which is a town in northern Afghanistan. And when I was there, this is sort of March 1999, it was still controlled by the Northern Alliance, which was this kind of rebel group that was holding out against the Taliban. The Taliban at the time controlled about 90% of the country. And then when I left, right after I left, the Taliban attacked, and, you know, and they took over the town. But then, a couple of years later, I went back, this very same street. And if you can see, I mean, it's not Times Square or anything, but it's, the celebration was just astonishing, you know. And it was a long time ago, because, of course, everything's much more complicated now. But, you know, these women were, like, throwing their burqas off, and, like, guys were digging up their TV sets out of the ground that they'd put in plastic bags. And it was amazing. It was an incredible time. And of course, it's all sort of changed now, but it was really an amazing time. Now, I think what I'm going to do is I'll just go through a couple more pictures. This is Ahmed Shah Massoud. I don't know if that rings a bell for many of you, but he was, you can see he looks like sort of a French painter. And he actually sort of was. I mean, he was an architect, or he wanted to be an architect. He spoke French. And he was, you know, these warlords in Afghanistan, they're like, you know, they sort of pull the limbs off of babies. I mean, they're really rough guys. And he was actually kind of an interesting character, as you can sort of see from the photo. He actually had sort of a sense of the world outside of himself. If you remember, he was killed by Al-Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. Al-Qaeda sort of figured that the Americans would come looking for him right after 9/11, and so they got rid of him a couple days beforehand. I saw him in sort of 1999. I'll just go through a couple of these, and then I'm just going to read you a couple paragraphs from my book. You can see he had a very modern army at the time. I think we flew in, it was this little town, and we flew in, and then, the engine, it was just kind of a disaster. But I'll just go through these really quickly. This was kind of nice. This was like all the old men were coming down from villages when they heard that, the Great One was in town. So they were kind of laying out their prostheses. Many of them were veterans from fighting the Russians at the time. Okay, I'm just gonna stop, and I'm gonna read a couple paragraphs about some of which will include him. Okay, if you'll just bear with me, it's just a couple of graphs. Let's see. Here we go. So keep in mind the photo that I showed you of Kabul, the one of the obliterated shopping street. In the late afternoons, the center of Kabul had an empty, twilight feel, a quiet that promised nothing more than another day like itself. There were hardly any cars then, just some women floating silently in their head-to-toe burqas. Old meat hung in the stalls, buildings listed in the ruins. One of those afternoons, a thin little shoeshine boy walked up to me. He was smiling and running his finger across his throat. "Mother is no more," he said, finger across his neck. "Father is finished." His name was Nasir, and he repeated the phrase in German and in French, smiling as he did. "Mutter ist nicht mehr, Vater ist fertig." He dragged his finger across his throat again. "Rockets," he said, "Rocketen." His pale green eyes were rimmed in black. He did not ask for money. He wanted to clean my boots. Then he was gone, scampering down the muddy street with his tiny wooden box. Kabul was full of orphans like Nasir, woebegone children who peddled little labors and fantastic tales of grief. You'd see them in packs of 50, and sometimes even 100, skittering in mismatched shoes and muddy faces. They'd thunder up to you like a herd of wild horses. You could hear the padding of so many tiny feet. Sometimes I'd wonder where all the parents had gone, why they let their children run around like that, and then I'd catch myself. The orphans would get out of control sometimes, especially when they saw a foreigner grabbing and shoving one another, until they were scattered by one of the Taliban guards with a whip. They'd come out of nowhere, the whip wielders, like they'd been waiting off stage. The kids would squeal and scatter, then circle back again, grinning. If I raised a hand, they'd flinch like strays. If a war went on long enough, the men always died, and someone had to take their place. Once I found 7 boy soldiers fighting for the Northern Alliance on a hilltop in a place called Bangui. The Taliban positions were just in view, a minefield in between. The boys were wolf-like, monosyllabic with no attention spans, eyes always darting, laughing the whole time, dark fuzz instead of beards. They wore oddly matched apparel like high-top tennis shoes and hammer and sickle belts, embroidered Hodge caps, and Russian rifles. I tried to corner one of the boys on the hill. His face was half wrapped in a checkered scarf that covered his mouth. "Abdul Waqdud," he said. All I could see were his eyes. I kept asking him how old he was, and he kept looking over at his brother. His father had been killed a year before, he said, but they fed him here, and with the money, he could take care of his whole family, $30 a month. "My mother is not weeping," Abdul said. I could see how bored he was, and his friends definitely noticed because one of them started firing his Kalashnikov over our heads. That really got them going, laughing hilariously and falling over each other. 2 of them started wrestling. My photographer and I calmed them down and asked them to pose in a picture with us, and they lined up and grew very grave. After that, they stood behind us in a semicircle and raised their guns, not like they were aiming at anything, but more like they were saluting. Then a couple of men appeared on the hilltop, bearing a kettle of rice, and the boys descended on it. The Taliban came down the road a few months later. I've got the boy's picture on a bookcase in my apartment. So let me just give you a few more. These are all before 9/11. That's Abdul Waqdud, of course. Can't imagine what happened to those guys. That was March of 1999. I sort of like this photo because, you know, these kids couldn't read anything, much less English. And of course, you know, it's this kind of Quranic injunction against drug smuggling or something. And, you know, I mean, the entire economy was like, you know, sustained by drug smuggling. So anyway, there were, you know, you could see they were gainfully employed. Let me just go through these really quickly. There's Abdul Waqdud again. I think we're getting into 2001 now, yes. This is northern Afghanistan. It's just astonishing, really. I mean, this is just, you know, we were just driving down the road here, and this is what it looks like. I mean, it can take you a day and a half to get from one village to another, of course, but this was a girls' school in northern Afghanistan. Remember, it was just the tiny pocket that wasn't controlled by the Taliban. Yeah, they're just amazing. You know, you can see when you're in Afghanistan, it's astonishing. You can, you know, the Silk Road sort of runs right through it, and you can just kind of, you know, I mean, she could be from Cleveland, you know. I mean, and that's kind of the way they all look. I mean, it's just really amazing. This is a cemetery, and again, I think we're in 2001. You know, I was trying to space out what I was going to read to you a little bit more, but I think I'm coming on to another point where I wanted to read to you a little bit. Yes, we're definitely in 2001. Now, if you remember, 9/11 happened, and you know, I was just happened to be in New York that day, and I went down to Ground Zero that day, and I stayed down at Ground Zero for about a week. I was kind of inside the little perimeter there, and I didn't want to leave because I knew the police wouldn't let me back in. And after about a week, I went back to the newsroom. And, you know, some editor walked over to my desk. You know, they're always, like, really on top of things. And he said, hadn't you been to Afghanistan before? And, you know, so in a couple of days, you know, I was on an airplane, and I was, like, flying to, you know, Tajikistan. And I'll just show you a couple more of these, and then I'll read something to you. This is kind of funny because, you know, this is the Northern Alliance, and they were basically just these kind of wild men with Kalashnikovs. And they had these sort of spanking new uniforms one day, you know, photo-worthy now. And they had dropped out of the sky, of course, from these American planes. And so they were all sort of spiffed up. Let me just go through these really quickly. This is basically the day the war started in October of 2001. I think I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs from that time. I don't know how many of you have actually seen a 2,000-pound bomb go off, but you know, it's not like the movies. It's you know, it's like the world comes to an end. And I remember the earth would just shake and shake. It's like an earthquake. And so they had just begun. Sort of the Taliban lines were kind of just over here, and they had just begun to bomb. And James and I, the guy I was traveling with, James and I were sort of making our way to the front. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to read you a couple more graphs, and then I'll show you a couple of more photos. Okay, that's a good place. Just bear with me. I'll read you a couple of graphs, and then there's only one more after that. Turn that cell on. Okay. All right. This isn't too long. Again, this is about October 2001. On a clear day, you could see the B-52s overhead, their contrails marking the sky in long white streaks. They seemed to float up there, so high above. Sometimes, given their altitude, they took half an hour to traverse the whole horizon. The exhaust plumes hung in the air long after the planes had moved on. So on some afternoons, the whole sky would be looped and crisscrossed, white against the blue, like a work of abstract art. It wasn't just the bombs they dropped that were so unnerving. It was the lumbering, disassociative way they let them go. One of the bombers would make an appearance, usually at 30,000 feet, a tiny gray V in the sky, all the way from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, 3,000 miles away, gliding like a crane. Then, without warning, the sharp, titanic bursts, the clouds tumbling upwards, the ground moaning as if something crucial in the world had broken off and fallen away. And then you'd look up, and there the plane would be, arcing, plodding, moving against the great blue sky. Sometimes at night, working late in the mud brick hut, I'd hear the faint whoop, 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 and I'd rush outside, and if I was lucky, I'd see a blackened silhouette against the star-flecked night. A helicopter without lights, here then gone. The Americans were here, the Afghans said, but I didn't see any of them until much later. On the morning the bombing started, the windows in my house clinked and rattled for minutes on end, like a tea service in an earthquake. I drove as fast as I could, as far as I could, forded the Kokcha River on a horse, ran crouching through the muddy Northern Alliance trenches, reached the most forward post, and peeked my head up over the top. The Taliban positions were just in view, only 300 yards away. A rolling green field lay between. Up and down the Taliban trench line, the blasts from the bombs had left gigantic circles of blackened grass, like the footprints of some huge beast, 50 feet wide. Blackened hoof after blackened hoof, concentric and overlapping. The bombs had hit the trenches precisely, gone directly inside. And there, across the field, rose the turban head of a Taliban soldier, looking to his right and then to his left, amazed, perhaps, that he was alive. I felt sorry for those Taliban fighters. I really did, just sitting in their trenches, trapped, uncomprehending, waiting to be bombed. I was right about that, right about what they felt. I saw the Taliban prisoners afterwards, dirty and frightened, and all they talked about were the bombs. For the Taliban, the waiting was the worst. A B-52 would appear in the sky, drop a bomb or two, and then begin its great U-turn toward its home on Diego Garcia. The B-52s took forever to make that turn, arcing slowly and grandly, turning like an aircraft carrier. And just when I thought the B-52 was finally headed south, headed home, it would keep turning, keep circling back, and then I knew it was coming back for another run. Sometimes it would take half an hour. And then I'd imagine the Taliban guys in their trenches, fiddling with their prayer beads, looking up, waiting. I've just got a few more of these from that war, and then we'll go to the next war. Not as picturesque, I'm afraid. You know, I could talk for 30 minutes about every photo in here. This is like, this is amazing. It's a sequence of 3 photos. There's a town in northern Afghanistan called Kunduz, and in November 2001, there were several thousand Taliban and al-Qaeda guys who were trapped inside of it. And the Northern Alliance, the guys we were traveling with, basically encircled the place. The Americans were bombing them from the outside. And we thought that the Taliban had surrendered. And so the army is kind of marching in here. Everybody was kind of celebrating. You see how beautiful it is there. But it turned out it was a double cross, and there was actually no surrender. So everything went bad, and we almost didn't make it out alive. But here, I'm going to have to go through these pretty quickly so I don't keep you here all night. There's a couple of nice photos here in just a second. This is pretty amazing. You can't really see it here, but this is northern Afghanistan, and it's the steppe. And you can see the mountains here, but kind of going this way, it's as flat as a pool table, and it stretches for as far as the eye can see, and you won't even see a tree. You know, it's so flat. And James and I were driving across northern Afghanistan. It was like November 30th, I think, and in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly, we come across 10 trucks full of Taliban prisoners. It was like a mirage. I remember I was sleeping, and James was like beating me on the head with his camera. And it was just an amazing, you know, the Afghans didn't take prisoners. They never took prisoners. And so I think they were on their best behavior because the Americans were there. So they kind of were doing their best here, jamming them into the truck. But it's really extraordinary. When you look at these photos, I remember they let us walk up to the trucks, and you could hear these people kind of crying out for water, and it was like water in about 7 languages. It was Arabic and Pashto and Urdu and Chechen, and you know, it was just kind of the whole thing. It was like a babble for water, and you know, you can see they're all just kind of packed in there like sardines. As it happens, I think it's pretty clear that these guys were just basically shot and buried in the desert not long after we left here. I mean, it's kind of the Afghan way. Let's see here. Yeah, it was just an amazing moment. And then we just got in the car and drove off, you know. I mean, it was really strange. think I'm almost just about done here. Actually, this is a scene. I don't know how many of you remember when John Walker Lind, the American Taliban, was captured. He was actually under the ground here. This is a prison in Mazar-e-Sharif, and there was the big battle. And you can see the Afghans kind of looking for shoes that fit and rings on fingers to take away. But here, let me just tear through here. See, I could talk for, I'm going to speed up here. But this is a Saudi, a 19-year-old Saudi kid. His name was Nasir. And I met him in Mazar-e-Sharif. He'd been taken prisoner. He was fighting with the Taliban. I use that word loosely. A lot of these guys, and Nasir was kind of Exhibit A, it was kind of a fool's journey. I sat and kind of talked to him for about an hour. And, he didn't really know where he was, and he was on Hajj, in Mecca, and somebody had recruited him, and kind of one thing led to another, and he wanted to make his family proud, and he suddenly found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think they killed him, too, afterwards. Again, kind of the Afghan way. Actually, this is yours truly. I think at this point I hadn't taken a shower in about 6 months. But and this is the road to, I'm not joking, this is actually the road to, you can see how stunning the landscape is, the road to Kandahar, in western Afghanistan. It's just amazing. That highway was actually built by the Soviet Union. And there's Kabul. Now I'm going to do something terrible, which is I'm going to ask you to change gears in your head really hard because we're going to talk about Iraq. I left Afghanistan in about late 2002. I spent most of the year there kind of going in and out. On March 2003, I rented a Ford Yukon in Kuwait City, and I drove into Iraq on the first day of the war. It was like the dumbest thing I ever did. I was with James Hill, the same guy who took these photos. And I should tell you a quick story about the rental car. I drove in, and it was this enormous invasion. It was 165,000 American troops. And James and I were kind of weaving in and out. We went all the way to Baghdad, 300 miles. And the car didn't have a scratch. We were dodging airstrikes the whole time, and we almost got killed like 50 times. But we got to Baghdad on April 9th, the day the regime fell. Everything was great. We stayed for about 6 weeks after that, and finally, I had to take the rent-a-car back. And no, seriously. And I remember when I had gone in, it was Kuwait City, and I went into the Hertz rental car, and the guy kind of looked at me and he said, "You're not going to," and I said, "No, just go for it. Take the family for, but I was quite pleased, by sort of late May that the Yukon was in such wonderful shape. And so I drove the thing all the way back, 300 miles. I got to the Kuwaiti border. I bribed all the people to get across the border. And I drove the thing I was very pleased with myself. I drove the thing into the parking lot of the Hertz rental car. And as I was getting out of the car, somebody backed into me and took off the side view mirror, It's very sad. It's a true story. Anyway, so we're talking about Iraq now. So bang. Okay, as if you need to see a map of Iraq. Again, there's some really nice photos. I'm just going to blow through these very fast. The best part about this, of course, is the pack of Skittles. I don't know if you can see it, but this was like during a sandstorm. But, we kind of drove up. This was after an ambush. It's like the second or third day of the war. Let me just go through some stuff here. How much time do I have? Yeah, see, I'm going on too long. I'm sorry. This is actually, I do want to stop here. This is actually April 9th, 2003, the day the regime fell. And, of course, it was sort of the day that everything changed. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it. All this stuff is in the book, but James and I, in the rented Yukon, we drove up to, we spent the night in a palm grove outside of Baghdad on April 8th, and 2003. And we were kind of shadowing these Marines who were there. And I remember we talked to this Marine colonel, and he said, well, we're going to go in tomorrow, and we don't know if there's going to be a fight or not. So we were a little nervous, but, we started driving in by 7 a.m. This is a nice shot. This is one of Saddam's palaces. Happier times, clearly. We started driving in, and it was clear that there was no resistance whatsoever. And the image I remember is the little piles of uniforms, everywhere. And we saw that all the way up and all the way up to Baghdad. These guys literally were just taking their uniforms off, And this is the central bank, which, of course, you know, by 10 a.m., the looting had started. By noon, the ministries were on fire. And you know the rest. And I'll just tell you a really quick story from that period. That same day, you know, we were driving around in the Yukon, and I found myself in front of the offices of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, which is kind of a joke, you know, but it was the kind of personal fief of one of Saddam's really quite deranged sons named Uday, and the Iraqis had just completely descended on it. You know, they were tearing it to pieces, and it was an amazing thing. Then, you know, they had these kind of hollow-eyed, you know, this hollow-eyed look, and they were just ripping stuff out and tearing it away, and they were carrying off stuff they didn't, you know, computer board stuff they didn't even understand. And we were watching all this, and I remember Uday had kept these beautiful Arabian horses, and they were kind of probably $500,000 each. And they were freeing the horses, and they were trying to catch the horses, and the horses were standing up on their hind legs. And it was just this kind of surreal scene. And we were watching it, and of course there were plumes of fire coming from the ministries now, you know, and there's looting all over the city. And I remember there was a 24-year-old Marine lieutenant. They're all very young. I mean, this guy was 24 years old. He was in command of 150 guys. And I turned to him and I said, you know, what are you going to do? And he said, I don't have any orders, you know. He was very frustrated, you know. And then I remember he did one thing, and then I'll move on here, but I think he got kind of angry at my question, and he lined his men up, a platoon of men, about 40 guys, and they started marching in front of the Olympic Committee offices, back and forth, and back and forth. And they didn't do anything, you know. It was like they were thinking maybe we'll scare them off, you know. But it was like by noon, like America was already a paper tiger, you know, and the Iraqis didn't even look up, you know. Anyway, it's a nice photo. Needs hardly any explanation. I'm just going to run through really quick some of these photos. You know, I should just say something really briefly here. No, I shouldn't. I'm running out of time. Sorry. All right, really quickly. Well, you know, look, here you are, right? I mean, he's like a 19-year-old from Kansas, right? Most of these guys are. You know, they're not from Sandy Springs. They're not. You know, they're not from Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Santa Monica, or Manhattan. You know, they're from Starkville, Mississippi, or Waycross, Georgia, you know. And you can see, I mean, kind of what happened in the war, really. I mean, you can kind of see it all here. You know, the Americans, it was obvious at the time, but the Americans weren't really ready for an insurgency, and so they would go into these villages, and, you know, somebody would plant a bomb or something, and they were kind of, they just grab everybody, you know. I mean, any male, you know, from between the age of 19 and 35 didn't look like he was, you know, on the up and up, they'd grab him. And you could see that, you could certainly understand why they wanted to do that, but of course they weren't shrinking the insurgency, they were just growing it. And, you know, you could see that's very different now. You know, I was just in Iraq, I just came back about 10 days ago. And the strategy, I mean, it's much, much better. It really is. And it's a completely different sort of mindset now. I mean, now it's sort of, it's not kill and capture the bad guys, it's sort of make friends with, you know, make friends with the good guys, which is basically 95% of the population. So it's totally different now, but it's a nice photo. Yeah, kind of sums it up. Let me just, I'm going to have to go through these really quickly. I don't know why I put this in there. This is a Kurdish graveyard. I think I put this in there to remind myself, but, you know, there's so much, I mean, I think in the book, when I compared going into Iraq, like we were breaking into a mental institution, and I say that with, not as a joke, but with the greatest sympathy as well. It's this place that had been kind of horribly traumatized, you know, in every way. And every Iraqi that you meet has some horrific story to tell about his brother disappeared, or his sister taken away, or his father killed. And in this case, these graveyards are all over Kurdistan. I mean, they call it, I mean, this was the Anfal campaign in the 1980s that Saddam undertook, but the Kurds call it the War of Annihilation. And 180,000 Kurds were killed, you know, in the 1980s. This is just one graveyard, you know, of many, many. Let me just, okay, really, I'm not going to talk for much longer. God, I just keep going on here. You know, one of the things that's frustrating if you're an American reporter in Iraq is, and particularly I see this when I come home, you know, some guy in the news says, well, 50 people were killed today in a car bomb. All right, what does that mean? You know, big deal, you know, move on. If you've ever been to a car bombing, it's like the end of the world, you know. It is really like absolutely the end of the world as you know it. This was a car bombing it was a suicide car bombing that took place. As it happened, it was about 200 yards away from the house that the New York Times rents. We just rent a house in the neighborhood. You know, we don't live in the green zone. And I remember it was about 8:30 in the morning, and the walls of the house just kind of shook like a toy. And we ran down, and this was the International Committee for the Red Cross, which was bombed in October 2003. And it was right after the UN bombing, which you probably all remember. And, you know, within a week after the UN bombing and the ICRC, every aid organization was gone, you know. I mean, the insurgents were, whatever else they were very good. They were very smart, totally ruthless. But what I remember about this, I can't even show you. You see how young these guys are. It's crazy how young they are. They're just children, basically. You know, he didn't know where he was. What I remember about this is, more than anything, really, is he was like from Maine. He was like you know, like a reservist from Maine. You know, I mean, he was like 21 years old. There was a girls' school. You can't really see it, but there was a girls' school right next door. And I remember we got to this place right before the police did, before the American soldiers, because it was so close to our house. And I remember the Iraqi schoolgirls who were running out of the school with their kind of white shirts and blue uniforms and kind of, you know, open mouth, wide eye. You know, that's the sort of thing you don't forget. Oh, okay. I'm moving very quickly. This is the Muqsin Mosque. It's an outdoor mosque. It's in Sadr City. And I don't know if you can see here, but this is a kind of faded poster of Muqtada al-Sadr, the kind of the crazy young cleric. And it's an astonishing thing if you can go to this mosque, and literally, I mean, you know, the photographer who took this, Ashley Gilbertson, and I were standing right here and kind of in front of it. And, you know, this is all men. You won't see a woman for 5 miles. But the bodies just go back and back and back. And, you know, on a Friday afternoon for Friday prayers, you'll get 25,000 people. And if you're just kind of standing here, and they start to chant, you know, Muqtada, 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 you can literally kind of feel the waves coming off the crowd. It's just, you know, boy, I used to go there just to remind myself kind of how powerful it was. Anyway, it's in the book. Oh, sorry, I think you saw that one. We're almost done. You know, this is just, we were in a house here. I don't know why I threw this in here. We were getting bombarded here, and kind of everyone at this point was kind of losing their minds. And some of the photos you're going to see here are the big, I don't know how many of you remember, but the biggest battle of the Iraq War was the assault on Fallujah in November 2004. About 600 Americans were wounded, about 100 were killed. I went in with a company of Marines, Bravo company of the 1-8, 1st Battalion, 8th Regiment, about 150 guys. And at the end of 8 days, 25% of the guys I was with were dead or wounded. You know, in 8 days, you know, it was really, really intense. And these are these guys, and I just want to, I'll end with these photos here. Actually, that's one of the streets we went down. It was kind of house to house, street to street, block to block. You know, there was just a lot of fighting going on. And I just want to, actually, this is me kind of writing from the latrine in a quiet moment. So all these, all these are, you know, so these guys, again, you know, they're just, you know, he was from some small town in North Carolina. This was just during a break in the fighting, and Ashley just took some photos. And it's funny, you know, you can, these guys are also young, and they're so young that, you know, only a 19-year-old could, like, smoke a pack of cigarettes and then run 10 miles and do 50 pull-ups, you know. And that's kind of the way they all were. And some of these guys, unfortunately, this is DeMarcus Ware. He's from Martinsville, Virginia. He was killed a couple of days after this photo was taken. I'm just going to, I'll go through a couple more of these, and I think we're just about done. They're all just kind of sleeping. And This is Nathan Anderson over on the right. He was killed about 2 days afterwards, 2 days after the fighting, after this photo was taken. I think that's it. I went to, I'll just end on this short story. I went to, after the battle, you know, they lost, I don't know, I can't remember how many killed, 15 killed maybe in this unit. And they invited me to a memorial service in Jacksonville, North Carolina. You know, God knows where that is. And I flew there, and they had all the, it was held in a high school gymnasium. And, you know, I thought, I don't know, I was thinking there'll be a band there and music playing and all the TV stations will be there. And there was nobody. And this is it right here. You can't really see here, but, you know, there was no parade, there was nothing. It was kind of just these guys, and they didn't even pull out the rest of the bleachers. But anyway, on that kind of somber note, why don't I end? And then if you have any questions, I'll take your questions. Got to get you out in time for the debate.
We do have the mics. They are live. And since we are taking, it's very nice to get the questions recorded also, so it doesn't just look like a talking head. So if you could, if you have a question, please use the microphone.
I have one question. The title of your book, The Forever War, do you really think it's going to be a forever war? Because for instance, there was a student here from France studying for a PhD. So I said, what is the difference between America and Europe and France? So she blew me off. And the next day I took her out to lunch. So she answered the question. She was like, well, we laugh at you all, your little toys, your cars, your houses. Our culture is so much older. And the cultures you were just showing us, they're even older than Europe's cultures. And the land, the people, their ways. Do you think they're really going to change to democracy?
Well, there's no way to answer. No, I don't think the war is going to go on forever. You know, it's 10 years for me. I mean, it was 1998 in September I sat on that. It's already forever for me. That's what it feels like. I'll tell you really briefly. I was just in Iraq. I just came from there. It's much, much better. It's remarkable how much better it is. And, you know, politics aside, I'll just give you an example. There's a park out in front of the house in front of the New York Times house, and it's called Abend Park. It runs for about 3 miles along the east bank of the Tigris River. You know, that park in late 2006 was a complete. It was you know, it looked like a science fiction movie. I mean, it was strung with barbed wire. There was a militia checkpoint at one end. There was a kind of Iraqi army checkpoint. Nobody went into that park. No one. And I went there the other night, and at dusk, and there were 2,000 people walking around the park. Parents with children, women walking alone, which was like incomprehensible, you know, 2 years ago. So I think it's very, very fragile, the calm that there is. You know, it could all go tomorrow, but, you know, I don't know. You know, I mean, really, predicting the future in these places is a fool's game. It was just, you know, politics aside, it was nice to see. I mean, when you kind of walk through the park, you could sort of see the relief on people's faces. You know, just that the violence has sort of dropped so much.
First, as a comment that I think you underestimate the power of the images and what you have to say to all of us. And my advice for you for tomorrow night, wherever it is you are, is that you actually slow down and talk a little bit more and not worry so much about rushing through things.
Thanks.
So but that's for tomorrow night. Actually, last night on the NewsHour, the last comment that you made was you said, all politics aside, you've just been back to Iraq,
yes,
and there's an amazing difference.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you might comment on the big issue with McCain, for instance, is that the surge really is working. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say this. I think it's two things. It is the surge. You know, they put a lot more troops in there. But they didn't just put a lot more troops in there. They put more troops in there, but they put them into the neighborhoods round the clock. They had never done that before. And I remember really, in a couple of years ago, you could go to these bases, like, for example, Camp Spiker. It's about 2 hours north of Baghdad. 17,000 American troops on it. Baskin-Robbins, Burger King, Hertz Rent-A-Car. And it was, but they sort of would go out from these bases and kind of go on patrol and then come back, and they didn't really, and the violence was sort of spinning out of control. They're now in the neighborhoods all the time in these little sort of bases, and that's one thing. I mean, it's remarkably calm. I mean, it's the violence in Baghdad is down by about 80%. In Anbar province, where I also went to, I mean, that's the cradle of the Sunni insurgency. I mean, I was there in 2006, and it looked like Dresden in 1945. I mean, I'm talking about downtown Ramadi, completely destroyed. There was one building in the middle of the town called the Government Center, kind of a joke. I mean, there was no government, there was no center, but the Marines were sort of holding it at all cost. We got attacked every day that I was there. Soldiers were getting killed every single day. I just went back there, I can only tell you what I saw. The roads were paved, the rubble was cleared away. The Americans were walking around without helmets on, without guns. And I think, and that's to kind of answer the second part of your question, which is, it's the surge, but it's also this thing called the Sunni awakening, which is an amazing, it's totally weird, and I'll tell you really briefly about it. Because I talked to these guys, and basically what happened was, I mean, I'll tell you a conversation I had with a Sunni guy who's now an Iraqi police colonel, and he freely told me, he said, 2 years ago, I was blowing up Humvees. I was killing Americans. That's what I wanted to do, drive the invader out of the country. Al-Qaeda comes along. They want us to do more. They want us to kill Iraqis. They want us to blow up Shiite mosques. We didn't want to do that. So they started killing us. So, we had Al-Qaeda on one hand. We had the Shiite government on the other that was sending death squads into our neighborhoods. So who's left? Who's our only friend? It's the Americans. And so kind of overnight, literally overnight, you just have this kind of cascading effect. Basically, the Americans made a bunch of deals with a bunch of tribal leaders, handed out a lot of money. And so you now have 100,000 Sunni gunmen, many of them former insurgents, on the American payroll. And it's an amazing thing to see. I mean, you can sit across from these guys, and they will tell you. Is it fragile? Yeah, it's really fragile, But it is what it is. The violence in Anbar province is down 90%. In Baghdad, it's down 80%. So it's a house of cards, I think. But it's, a house of cards is better than no house at all. So we'll see, Long answer. Here.
Well, you described the essence of my question there, but the real essence of my question is the nitty-gritty of this business of paying 100,000 people $300 a month to perform in these, I call them brigades. Well, was this really a militarily strategic move, or was it a political move in a sensitive time in our political process?
I think it's, look, I mean, you meet the American officers over there, they work around the clock. I mean, if you take somebody like David Petraeus, the general who just went home, he spent 48 months there out of the past 5 years. He's been away from home a long time. They're very smart. Basically, they're just looking for anything that works, but let me just tell you one more quick story of what I saw. It was amazing, amazing scene. I drove up, just a couple weeks ago, I drove up to Adamiyah, which is a neighborhood in northern Baghdad. And in 2006, that neighborhood was completely controlled by Al-Qaeda, completely. I mean, the American military didn't even go in there. I was there at dusk. I was talking to a bunch of awakening guys, and sitting across from me was his last name was Al-Takridi, which, he was from Saddam's hometown, absolutely insurgent, a former Ba'athist, a former military officer, now working for the Americans. But he was very proud, of this, and he said, I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this for my respect, and it's taken me a long time to get this back. And so we're having this conversation, and then an amazing sight, a wedding procession comes down the street, 25 cars. All the Iraqis get married on Thursday nights. for some stranger. It's Thursday night. Everybody gets married. So it was a Thursday night. And this wedding procession comes down the street, long row of cars, people are playing music, and they're dancing, and really unimaginable 2 years ago, not even comprehensible. And so they saw me, the people in the wedding, and they stopped. And, they wanted to check out the guy who was like the CIA agent. And the groom got out of the car, and I could see the bride, she had sort of, that part of the world, a lot of rouge, and the white flowing dress. And the groom got out, and he shook my hand, and he said, "Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful?" And then he looked over at the Awakening guys, and he said, "It's all because of them." So, it is what it is, pretty fragile, but better than nothing, I think. Anyway, take a couple more.
Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Not a question, but a comment. I just want to say thank you.
Sure, thank you.
For many of us, I got in country in September of '04, and my stories are too close to the surface. I can't tell them. But it's cathartic for me to be able to read yours, because then when people ask me what's going on, I can just say, just read the book. I can't talk about it. So just thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. It's very nice of you.
I was wondering how you dealt with the multiplicity of languages. Like, how did you comprehend what was going on? And the other thing is, what did you understand?
I speak great Spanish is the answer. But,
what did you understand by the term "in revenge there is life"? And the third question is, did you know Greg Mortensen in Afghanistan?
No. He's an ESPN guy, I thought. No. Anyway.
No, he's Afghanistan.
No, that's Pakistan. No, I have to tell you a really quick story about the language thing. Really, my Spanish is great. It goes absolutely nowhere in Iraq. But I don't speak Arabic, and I don't speak Pashto, and I don't speak Urdu or anything else. And we rely on these kind of really extraordinary local people. One of whom I want to tell you about, a quick story about. His name is Wazir Jaff. And, you work with these people so closely, and they're just like sort of brothers, And my translator for 3 years in Iraq was a guy named Jaff, and he was this kind of tall, good-looking. He looked like Clint Eastwood, and he had fought for the Peshmerga with Kurds, and he spoke perfect English, perfect Arabic, perfect Kurdish. And I'll just tell you a quick story. One day, Jaff and I were kind of talking, and I said, we should really go interview, Sheikh Ahmed, because he's such a strange guy, and like, who does he says that he likes us, but. So we went over and saw Sheikh Ahmed, and we sat down with Sheikh Ahmed. I had my list of sort of, silly questions, and he and Jaff got into this long conversation in Arabic, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And they were talking, and I was saying, Jaff, I want to talk to you. And Jaff kept saying, just hang on. And the conversation got kind of heated, And then finally, it was over, and the Sheikh said, okay, tea for my American friend, and cookies and everything. And so I asked him, I started asking these, ridiculous questions about the Iraqi constitution or something. And so about an hour later when we were finished, the Sheikh couldn't have been more hospitable. We were driving back in the car, and I turned to Jaff, and I said, Jaff, what were you guys talking about back there, My God, you went on forever. And Jaff said, he's like lighting a cigarette, and he said, well, Sheikh Ahmed wanted to kidnap you. And so there was this, this entire conversation unfolding right in front of me, and I didn't have the slightest idea, And so, fortunately for me, I don't know how many know Kurdistan, but the Jaff tribe is a very large tribe in Kurdistan. And so Jaff said to him very firmly, my tribe is way bigger than your tribe, and you're going to be in deep trouble. And the Sheikh, he's like, okay, it was just an idea, tea for my American friend. Anyway, to answer your question.
I also want to say thank you for your sacrifices,
Sure.
and for you being able to bring these stories to life for all of us. What was your interpretation? What's your impression of the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani and his overall influence for the region as far as being able to influence al-Maliki when Sadr comes back? Like the hierarchy around al-Sistani, what you think their overall vision for the country might be?
Boy, that's a hard one. The Shiites, it's the majority in Iraq, For me, I always thought of them as the Catholics and the Sunnis were the Protestants because the Shiites had a kind of religious hierarchy. And, Grand Ayatollah Sistani was sort of the Pope, whereas the Sunnis don't have anything like that. They're sort of the Protestants. There's no kind of formal, leadership. And so the Shiites have these kind of Ayatollahs at the top, and they're very kind of, they're very, very learned, and they're very political. And Sistani is, the guy at the top. And he's very, very mysterious. He doesn't meet with Americans. I don't think he ever has. And so, he puts out statements occasionally, which everybody kind of reads and tries to figure out. But I think the short answer to your question is that at some level there's a civil war inside the country. I think it's been stopped for now. But at the same time, there's kind of a civil war going on among the Shiites as well. It's very sort of low level, but they're kind of, there's Sistani on one hand, and there's Muqtada al-Sadr on the other, and they're kind of sorting these things out as well. The trouble in Iraq when they do this is that everybody has guns, so I know that's not a great answer to your question, but
have you heard much of al-Sistani coordinating with Petraeus or Odinero or any
No,
other
I think when
generals?
Sistani talks to the Americans, he doesn't talk directly to them. He talks to Iraqis who talk to the Americans, and they pass messages back and forth to each other.
Do you get the feeling that he's like the centerpiece or the keystone, and when he passes that there's a whole other echelon that's waiting to go a different direction than him?
Well, he's an old man, and I think he'll probably die soon, so I guess we'll find out. I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Okay, a couple more.
My question is, if in a year or so the American military pulls out, do you have any idea about whether or not the Iraqis, the Shiites, and the Kurds and the Sunnis can resolve their problems and stabilize their country?
I should have started this by saying, don't ask me to predict the future.
That's
I don't know. I think
$64,000 question.
Of course. I don't know. I think that's the big question. Is it if the Americans leave, is this what's going to happen? Is this peace that they've constructed there self-sustaining? I think the answer is it's not. I think, I had a conversation with General Petraeus. He used that word. He said it's not self-sustaining. I think they want to try to make it self-sustaining. I think it'll take longer than a year if it's going to be self-sustaining.
Forever war, like you said.
Well, I think, ultimately it may be that how many American troops are in Iraq are determined not by conditions on the ground. They're going to be determined by politics in America and politics in Iraq. So, I don't know. I think we'll see. Okay, last one? Yeah, last one.
Hello. Si prefiere, le puedo preguntar en español, si es mejor.
Oh, no, don't do that. He's trying to kidnap me,
Salam alaikum. I just you've been there you've been through this for 10 years. You brought back images of civilians and even children that are living in the midst of all this. They don't have the luxury to take sides. And a war that, goes on and on. And I'd like not to you to predict, but to think for us, with us, if we extrapolate this getting the allegiance of or buying or whatever, the 100,000 awakening, and the success of that shift in counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq, take it back to Afghanistan also.
Right.
And we have even Obama now saying almost, we made a distraction in the first place. Let's get into Afghanistan. Let's get more troops there.
Yeah.
And we have the border and so on. What do you think? There's any analogy, any extrapolation makes any sense of this same type of counterinsurgency strategy from not just the surge, but from the allegiance of those people? If you make some sort of attempt to do something similar in Afghanistan? And also, thank you.
I don't know Afghanistan that well. I just haven't been there in a long time.
No tiene que ser en inglés.
I was just in Pakistan, actually. I was making a tour of the world's vacation spots before I looked for it. I was just in Pakistan, and I know you'd think I'd done something terribly wrong. My newspaper sent me to Pakistan, and then they sent me to Iraq. I was in Pakistan right on the border in eastern It's kind of right on the eastern border of Afghanistan. It's called the tribal areas. It's kind of where American intelligence people believe that Osama bin Laden and probably Ayman Zawahiri are hiding. I wrote a long story about it, but it's become important because the Taliban are now not just in Afghanistan, but they're in Pakistan now. They have these kind of sanctuaries where they can operate very freely. They have training camps. I actually was able to go in and talk to some Taliban people and get out. I was very happy to get out. I think the short answer is probably no, that you can't really take the lessons of Iraq and move them over. I mean, except in a very, very general way, which is, you have to try to befriend the locals. But it's just, God, if you've ever been to Afghanistan, I mean, you saw the pictures. It looks like the Grand Canyon. I mean, that's, and it's like, it just doesn't, I mean, if you were going to surge in Afghanistan, I mean, well, that's what the Soviet Union tried to do. I mean, you'd need 2 million troops. I mean, not 30,000 extra ones, I mean, it's a beautiful, stunning country, but the terrain is kind of everything there, It's these vast mountains and kind of deserts, and I don't know how they do it. And I think, to answer your question about the awakening, the tribes in Afghanistan have basically, that country's been at war for 30 years, and the tribal networks there have basically been wiped out. They're just not the same anymore. So whereas in Iraq, we could kind of pick them up and kind of resuscitate them, there aren't a lot of people. I mean, General McKiernan in Afghanistan was just talking about that. It doesn't really look like that's going to be possible in Afghanistan, so they're going to have to think of something else. But I think it's very, very, it's a strange thing that's happened. It's like the good war, which is Afghanistan. The good war has kind of gone bad. And for the moment, the bad war, Iraq, has kind of gotten a little better. So with that, I think, I guess we'll end this, and I'll go out there and maybe sign some books. But thank you.